Mineral spirits. You don't need it. Traditional mediums like liquid. You don't need it. In this week's episode, I'll be guiding you along the process involved in creating this oil painting. This is a classical style oil painting that involves some of the techniques such as chiaroscuro and Zorn palette basic flesh tone color mixtures, all using water mixable oil paints, but starting off with acrylic paint. The acrylic paint in the beginning is going to be very useful, and I'll be explaining that in the footage. Let's get into some of the materials. I'll be using black acrylic paint, burnt umber acrylic paint, titanium white acrylic paint, water, and a blow dryer in between layers. So we're starting on a 20 by 20 inch cotton canvas. I am toning with the burnt umber and ivory black in a very thick consistency. Now I'm going to draw using pastel. It really doesn't matter what you draw with as long as you can see the colors, and of course you can work on top of it with acrylic paint. Now I'm just trying to get a very basic block in of the head. You will see the photo reference in maybe one or two images, but for the actual photo reference, so there it is. So the photo reference, you will be able to click and download it, or just look at the link for the photo reference from a copyright-free website known as Unsplash. Now I'm going in with the titanium white, very, very thick, onto the cotton canvas. So what I'm trying to do is build a chiaroscuro effect. This is a classical approach. So remember, we're going to be using water mixable oil paints, but first we want to have a very classical ground to work on. But do we have to start with acrylic paints in order to use water mixable oil paints? You don't necessarily have to start with the acrylic underpainting at this point, but again, as I explained, it is important to have a foundation that you can build on. And with the acrylic paints, I was able to put in layer after layer after layer of acrylic paint, and then drying it with the blow dryer. It dries in a matter of minutes, sometimes less, and then it allowed me to continue to build the water mixable oil paint over top of that. If I were to be using traditional oil paints, then I probably would have went ahead with the wash of the odorless mineral spirits and probably something like burnt umber, and then I would have went over it with maybe like lead white, impasto lead white, to create a more traditional underpainting. So this process takes that classical approach, reinvents it in a way that doesn't use solvents and still attains very similar results. I'm using very, very thick acrylic paint, and I'm building the texture in the light. So if you think about a Rembrandt painting, we're going way back. You think about a Rembrandt painting, imagine how thick the lights are painted in contrast to the darks in the background. So that's why I showed you that the blow dryer, because in between the scenes here, I'm using the blow dryer to assist with the drying times. And now I'm going again with the background color, same colors, burnt umber and ivory black, very thick acrylic paint. And now you see the chiaroscuro. So you see the dark and light being built up in a very classical sense. Just simple geometric shapes. So now you're seeing the texture. It's kind of hard to see on the camera, but what I was doing was kind of caking on the acrylic paint, making sure that texture, especially in the highlight regions of the corner of the highlight on the forehead and below the tear duct, was very thick. Now after it dried, I used a microfiber cloth to wipe off some of the excess pastel. So what you're seeing is the underlying architecture for the development of this painting. This is it. This is what you've been waiting for. These are the paints that I'm using and the medium. And if you find yourself interested in wanting to purchase these types of materials, go to the description box down below where I have Amazon affiliate links ready for you to click and make your purchase. So don't worry, I'm going to tell you all about how this process works with water mixable oil paints as the footage plays. So I'm using the Zorn palette just to keep things simple. So I'm using titanium white from Cobra. All of these materials are from Cobra Talons. Check the description box down below again for more information. So I'm using Cobra Talons, if that's how you pronounce the last part, but either way, titanium white, yellow ochre, vermilion, and ivory black. So those of you that are watching and are very interested in learning how to use water mixable oil paints and not have any of the not have any of the negatives that is oftentimes associated with water mixable oil paints, listen up. Listen up, because this is going to be very, very important. From my experience using various different water mixable oil paint brands, Cobra is the closest to traditional oil paint. And some of you have recommended this in the comments in previous episodes. As you're seeing the paint develop, you're seeing it in a kind of a clip by clip fashion, but you're seeing how I'm working from the darks. But why are you starting with the darker halftones? And how does that help with the development of the painting? Now I'm building my way from the darkest darks. So I'm building my way from those darker halftones, walking my way little by little by little up to the highlights. Now why am I doing that? It's because when you have a middle tone, it helps a lot. It's actually the easiest, I think, when you have a middle tone, because your lights look like lights and your darks look like darks, like the great Nelson Shanks has been quoted as saying so. But the thing that I find is that the darks are really what describes the form. The form turns because of those halftones, because of the darks. Though it's more difficult for me to work from those bright lights all the way up, I find that in the end I have a painting that has much more volume. And it's kind of interesting to have the sense of volume in a painting without having too many details. But in either case, as you're seeing at this point in the video, I'm building my way from the darkest darks. And usually it's a little bit warmer. You see a little bit of the more true local flesh tone in the halftone. So that's why I'm also starting off a little bit warmer in those areas. But this isn't anything new. You've seen me do things like this with the traditional. So let's keep talking more about the water mixable. So the medium that I was showing you is also from Cobra. It is called quick drying medium. It is very close to the walnut alkyd medium that I was using with traditional oil paints, and it handles the exact same. One thing I need to point out, well, the first thing I should point out is that I am not sponsored by Cobra. I wish I was. If you know anyone that works in Cobra and would, help me get sponsored, if you would like to help me be sponsored by Cobra, I would love to be sponsored by Cobra, but in any case, I'm not sponsored by Cobra. What I'm trying to say is the only real negative to the Cobra that I find is the drying time. It takes a long time for these paints to dry, which I actually end up using to my advantage, believe it or not. So even with the quick drying medium, the Cobra definitely still takes much longer to dry, but a trade-off is it does have that kind of creamy type of melted butter consistency that traditional oil paints have. You're talking a lot, but I don't hear anything about the color mixtures. And what is this Zorn palette? How do you mix colors with the Zorn palette? Is it really just 4 colors? Zorn Limited Palette. It's a 4-color palette that is very useful for flesh tones. Again, the titanium white, which traditionally was lead white, the yellow ochre, the vermilion, and the ivory black. Sometimes people use cadmium red. I find that the vermilion here is actually much more useful and easier to create these color mixtures than the cadmium red was. Now, with the Zorn palette, you're seeing there as I'm using a little bit of a warm kind of combination of colors. And really the magic happens when you combine the vermilion with the yellow ochre to create an orange, and then you gray out that orange, combining the black and white to create a gray. And then you can have a kind of greenish color combining the yellow and the ivory black. But I go into much more detail into the explanation of those colors, in particular with water mixable Cobra oil colors, in my behind the scenes episodes on patreon.com. Now, as you're seeing me build the lights, I should explain why I'm using the Zorn limited palette. For one, I'm on a limited budget, so I didn't have all of the I basically didn't have all of the colors needed for the typical color palette that I have. I was actually using my Winsor Artisan and Holbein water mixables with the Cobra, and I had that kind of gooey consistency to the paints that I did not enjoy with water mixables before, so I just took them off the palette. And I decided to experiment with the Zorn palette because it is a 4-color palette, and if you can get a pretty good result with a 4-color palette, that means that the quality, or that implies or suggests that the quality of the pigments, the quality of the colors of the oil paint that you're using is pretty darn good. Based on the results that I had working with these colors, I find that the Vermilion is a really, really good warm red orangey color that can be combined to create incredible flesh tone combinations with the yellow ochre and the ivory black, and of course the titanium white. Now traditionally you would be using turpentine, lead white, and some type of medium that also has solvents and things like that. Not necessarily solvents, but maybe lead or something like that. So the point that I'm trying to drive home with this episode and with this approach is that you can start off with an acrylic underpainting and build the texture with the acrylic. I recommend doing it with the acrylic because you can have an impasto layer. You can have a underpainting that's very thick, but also not reflective, like oil paint is reflective. Acrylic is a little less reflective, and also it just dries a lot faster, and you don't have to use any solvents to thin out the paint. And as you're noticing, I'm applying the paint very, very thick, though it's kind of hard to see with the footage, but I'm applying the paint with very little medium. Okay, I get it. You're not using that much medium yet. But you know what? I really want to learn this stuff, but I don't know where I can learn this. Are you offering any online classes? I also offer online classes on my Patreon. Head on over to patreon.com/YupariArtist. Look for the mentorship tier. Select the mentorship tier, and you will find that I already have 2 lessons uploaded at the time that this video is uploaded. 2 lessons already uploaded that guide my students through projects, which they have the option of sending me images of their projects in progress for teacher-student constructive feedback every single week. And in my online classes, currently I'm building up my students starting from the classical approach. Speaking of the classical approach, again, the chiaroscuro effect that Caravaggio had with his paintings. As you can tell, I kind of overemphasized the eyebrows on the model, very similar to the kind of curvy fashion that Caravaggio would do. I did the very best that I could to get that brushy, that kind of aesthetic effect to the brushstrokes that Sargent had. Also, the simplicity of the shapes that Diego Velázquez had with his paintings, along with a little bit of the poetry in the pose that you would see in a John William Waterhouse, and also trying to paint with the confidence of Nelson Shanks. So a lot of the influence has come from artists of the past, and especially traditional painters of the past, and reinventing the way that oil paint was or is used. except without any of the solvents. You can thin the Cobra with water, and it doesn't degrade the oil paint as much as if you thin it out, as if you thin out something like a Windsor. If you have the Windsor Artisan and you thin it out, it degrades the paint a little bit. It doesn't with the Cobra. I was a little bit timid about that with Cobra, but I found that you can thin the Cobra with the water. Just know that it's an opposite kind of effect. If you thin traditional oil paints with solvent, it actually makes it dry a little bit faster, in my opinion. But if you thin out the Cobra with the water in your application of paint, it actually takes a little bit longer for it to dry if you thin it out with the water. So what about the medium? When do you use it? And why do you even use medium? And does it help at all with the texture of your oil painting? And I use more medium to cover areas such as the background and the clothing element of clothing here, simply because I don't want to paint the background too thick, so the medium helps to thin it out. Remember, I already had a thick layer of paint using the acrylic, and you can paint oil over acrylic according to conservationists, or at least people that are into art conservation that I know. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong in the comments down below, but it is kind of standard that you can put oil over acrylic. Now again, the background I want it to be a little bit more thin, as you're seeing there, and this area I want to be a little bit more thin, building thicker and thicker paints in the flesh tones and in the hand. Add to that I'm using a wooden palette, which was a very big concern of mine with water mixable oil paints. Now, given that I'm using a wooden palette, I'm not using that much water to thin out the paint, but when I do, it doesn't seep into the finish of the palette. So if you're going to use a wooden palette, make sure that you don't have too much oil paint. You don't have too much traditional oil paint layered onto your palette, or else the water will stick out. Now you're seeing something kind of crazy, right? Yep. I'm scraping the face off. And again, this is a little bit a la Sargent. So I'm thinking of John Singer Sargent, how he would take a palette knife to the face, basically push it back. This is something you can do with Cobra. That's a little bit harder to do with traditional, just because traditional dries a lot faster. With Cobra, I was able to work on this painting 2 days straight without the painting starting to get too tacky, which it would with traditional oil paints, even if you use a slow drying medium. So I scraped off some of the excess paint first to push it back, and then I used a dry brush to make the edges softer. So now I'm attacking the painting all over again, building from the middle tones out. And again, I'm going to stick with the Zorn palette the entire way. For the entire duration of the painting, I'm sticking with the Zorn palette. I find that, again, to mention what I had said before, if you want to test, now this is in my opinion, if you want to test the quality of the pigments of a particular type of oil paint, I recommend using a limited palette like the Zorn palette to test the pigments, because this was very much a test to the Cobra brand. And again, I highly recommend Cobra over Windsor, the Windsor Artisan brand. I recommend Cobra over the Holbein brand of water mixable. Those are the two other ones that I have used that have that kind of gummy texture. And not to get in any kind of trouble, but I find that I have not tried any medium with water mixable, and I've tried a lot. I haven't tried any medium that I enjoyed until I used the Cobra fast drying medium. The quick drying medium from Cobra combined with the Cobra oil paints is far superior than the other ones that I've tried. And I might add, this is a little controversial, but I kind of think that the Cobra colors are a little better to use than the Winsor Newton traditional for the Zorn palette. Maybe it's because I'm using Vermilion instead of Cad Red, I don't know. But I'm just going to go out there and say that because I was so impressed with the quality of these oil paints. Now, as you're seeing the footage start to slow down and my narration start to slow down and pace a little bit, I want to describe the aesthetic and the idea involved in the development of this painting. For one, I wanted to reinvent the way that one sees oil painting. One sometimes sees oil painting as you need to use solvent, you need to use lead, you need to use flammable liquids and things like that, which don't get me wrong, I will still continue to use traditional oil paints. I love using traditional oil paints and I won't stop using them. But I found that so many people are so concerned with the traditional, or they have an allergy or something like that. So I have been experimenting with these water mixables for a long time. In fact, my first YouTube video on water mixable I'm considering deleting because it was so bad. I didn't have the kind of knowledge that I have now. So I want this to be a guide for all of you that want to pursue, in particular, classical oil painting, painting in a classical oil painting style, but not have to use any of the solvents or worry about anything flammable. Also, to note that I will be training my online students in the classical painting technique, and some of my students don't want to use the solvents or the mediums, so I will be also instructing them on how to do this with more specificity with water mixables, and I'll also be training my students by uploading that video, that lesson every Monday. Every Monday they're going to have a lesson. Now let's talk about the clover, because that clover is not in the photo reference. I'm putting in a 4-leaf clover because I want this painting to represent luck. I need a lot of luck, to be honest, in order to make it as an artist. I want to make it as an artist, I really do. This, for me, is a representation, or hopefully a manifestation of luck, because I feel like I need that kind of luck. That being said, I really hope that this episode helps you out. I hope you find it insightful. Remember, if you want to take online classes with me, go to patreon.com/YupariArtist and sign up for the mentorship tier. New lessons for my students are uploaded every Monday, and I also give them the opportunity to send me images every week for teacher-student feedback. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode. And it's now time for our new patron shoutouts. So thank you, Kina Rodriguez, and thank you, Janet McAllen. Thank you, Ken Arredondo. Thank you, Keith Eclades. And I apologize if I mispronounced anyone's names. So welcome to my Patreon. I really hope that you'll like this week's behind the scenes episode with the Zorn color mixtures. Also, remember you can do the online lessons at your own pace. Remember to keep in contact with me. Thank you so much for becoming supporters on my Patreon. I wish you the best in all of your artwork, and I'll see you on the next episode.